We're doing something a little bit different, but also the same. So last Sunday, or 2 days ago, 3 days ago, we had Carl Jha, who presented something really, really valuable on the topic of understanding the entire dynamic shaping the Asia Pacific and also the deeper history of U.S. Chinese relations with a look to the future. It was a really good presentation, and I think this is going to be a really appropriate follow up. Let me just say, Li Kangzheng, who is going to be delivering today's remarks, is somebody who I've had the pleasure of corresponding with over the past few months, and I'd received an email during the summertime. Or no, it wasn't the summertime. It was actually while we were in Japan, actually, from Lee, who had researched and had followed a lot of the history work that Cynthia and myself have done on the Clash of the Two Americas, the entire roundtable movements, perversion of our recent history, and the deeper history of the British Empire per se, which is sort of like right in front of people's face. And when you look at it and you see it, you can't unsee it. But a lot of people just don't see what's right in front of them as far as the modern invisible structures of today's active British Empire, which is a direct consequence of something that took over Britain itself in the Venetian takeover period of the late 17th century and continues to exert influence around the world today. So Lee had incorporated a lot of those insights that we'd published into his own analysis on some of the deeper history and subtle currents shaping Japan, but also the broader Chinese matrix as well. So he said, he found that there were a few blind spots that I had, and he asked me to take a little time to receive a briefing from him. And I was expecting maybe a 10, 15-minute briefing. So I sat back on my computer and was shocked. And I'm not an easy person to shock, but I was shocked that there were a lot of new dynamics that I hadn't really considered before in the course of like a 2.5, 3-hour presentation that was delivered to me by Lee. So I said, hey, look, I wish that I had hit record. I wish that we had some way to actually retain this in the records as a reference point. So I didn't even hear fully where I had to leave to go to an interview. So I didn't even hear how the briefing was going to end. So anyway, today, Lee has agreed to deliver a comprehensive presentation. It's going to be, I think, a little bit longer than our typical presentation, but we'll still have Q&A. And for those who can stay on for the whole time, that's great. If you can't, it's all being recorded, so don't stress. And I guess with that, Lee, it's all yours. Go for it.
So thanks, Matt, for letting me share this stuff. I thought maybe the best way to begin was to offer up a little bit of a background, maybe to help everyone understand kind of why I'm here giving them all this information, why it matters to me, and kind of what my angle might be. Because as we kind of go through this, we'll see that something that is actually very relevant is it's like, who is telling a certain story to people, and what they might be leaving in it or taking out of it based on that. So for me, I never really thought about China that much. I'm not Chinese. My name looks Chinese. That's just something I'm doing to kind of protect my identity or whatever, because this topic I'm finding is becoming increasingly contentious in recent years. I plan to actually move to China in the coming months. Maybe once I'm there, I'll feel a little more open. But for now, this is how I'm kind of choosing to do things. But that being said, my first real encounter with China was when I was involved with a tech startup, and I actually had to go to China. That was where we were going to be manufacturing, and we went to go check it out. And it was a startup with just a couple people. So when I went, it was just me and I had a Chinese business partner who I'd be meeting with there. And before I went, everyone was warning me, as I'm sure you guys, a lot of you can imagine, they're saying, "Oh, shouldn't go. It's not going to be safe." And people would be constantly repeating to me all of the things they'd heard on the Western media. I think that was around the time there were some two Canadians, the two Michaels, who people here would ostensibly say they got kidnapped by China, and for all they knew, I would be the third Canadian going to China. I would try to explain to them, I'm pretty sure there's like 100,000 Canadians from what I see online in China right now, but that's what I kind of had to deal with. So I didn't really know what to expect, but when I got there, and I don't know if you can see this little video popping up. So this is kind of what I found. So this was actually from like my social media, my Instagram, and I was getting off the plane. I was noticing things weren't exactly what I expected. I was expecting somewhere where everybody was depressed, where everybody was potentially despondent. And I was hanging out with friends. My business partner was introducing me to lots of people. The streets, I was driving down and I'm like, dude, I feel like this must be what LA feels like. Like well manicured palm trees everywhere. All new cars I'd never heard of. Looking out the window, I would see more buildings being built than I'm pretty sure were being built in Canada across the whole country. I would see that just in my field of view. This whiskey bar here, that guy, he actually owns it and he's friends with my friend, and this is his small business. So seeing these pictures, it's not exactly what anyone would expect, because before I went, people would either say that it's going to be very backwards, like imagining like peasants, very poor people, or imagining a place where there's just complete social control. This is me climbing a tree in front of the police after, and I'm kind of ashamed of this because it's a pretty rude thing to do, to go to another country and start climbing trees on their street when you've had a few drinks at the club. But that's what I did, and I'm including this, although it's a bit embarrassing to me now. I'm showing it because I was in full view of police. If what people might think that it's a police state where everything's locked down, you can understand my experience doing this. It was so obvious to me that there weren't those kind of rules. When we were at the club, people are smoking in the club indoors. So there's a lot of instances where I actually felt like there was much less rules. When you saw at the beach there, right? We were driving ATVs down this beach, and I was imagining if I was to do that in Canada, I'd be violating some kind of environmental regulation, right? No motorized vehicles on the beach. There'd probably be a Ministry of Natural Resources officer coming after me here. We were doing that. I don't know if this barbecue would be up to code in Canada, but this is what I mean is I was so confronted with the freedom that people were actually experiencing that then when I came back, I was very excited to tell everybody that it turns out China's not what they thought when they warned me before I left. But what was even stranger was when I came back, I had somewhat naively thought that people would just trust me. But what I found was the same people that had been warning me, they weren't very open to it, and they would just continue to bring other points to me, and that kind of led me, since I'd already seen that none of this was real, that these situations they described was social credit scores and other draconian measures, they weren't in place. I already knew they weren't there, so it was an easier task for me to kind of try to pick apart where they were getting these ideas. And I think part of it was I wanted people to understand the reality as it actually is, and especially if they were people close to me. So I found that by like studying history, it's a lot like a garden or a landscape. When you're describing a landscape to somebody, there's a few things going on. So when you describe it, you're picking out certain key elements that you want to share. And if you think of it in terms of somebody who has a reason to be describing that to you, that's also going to change the manner in which they describe it. So in other words, if you have somebody selling you this property, this landscape that they're describing, they're going to leave out anything unflattering they're going to leave out the weeds, they're going to leave out the shrubs. There'll be some big things, some trees that might get mentioned, but a lot of the things which don't reflect so well on them will simply be left by the wayside. But then what can happen, which is even stranger, is you would think you could go to another source, get the information from somebody else. But often what I've actually found is when you go to do that, if the other sources also aren't, the history doesn't reflect very well on them, they'll leave those same pieces out. And what you can get is a situation where there are some major elements of Chinese history over the last 100 years, especially, last 200 years, last 100 years, that nobody knows both here and even in China. They're given very little attention, which was strange to me, but it actually ends up explaining a lot more about what's going on as you kind of get deeper into it. So in this first section, what I kind of want to do is put that stuff that's missing back in the landscape. And I think that will give us a really good context to then understand more of what's going on in China now. So for this lecture, what I did do was I had to go to a lot of primary sources. So there are foreign policy journals from the time period. So we're looking at like the 1920s and 1930s. There's also, I've made use of a lot of declassified intelligence reports. So these would have been written in the 50s and 60s to actually give legitimate information to people who might have been making decisions at that time. But over the years, through like FOIA requests and whatnot, they've been released. And the story they tell is very different from the story that you would get if you just tried to go to a more mainstream source to get some of this history. So as we start though, okay, one of the first things that people know, and so there's a book that recently came out by Ray Dalio, and it's called Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. This isn't the entire book. This is the PDF they give you when you get the audio book. And why I pulled it up is because he has a graph here, which I think is pretty good for illustrating some of this. So what you'll typically get in just a classic Western telling of the story is China has been ruled by successive dynasties. The further back you go, the history starts to blur into myth. So you might have even heard that the Chinese origin story in itself is actually more of a restoration. So the Huangdi emperor, who it's debated whether he even existed, when he arises, it's not a genesis. It's not the beginning of China, because in fact, when he comes about, and this is several thousand years ago, his role is to really restore a China which previously in this myth had already existed, but had fallen into chaos. And his role in reuniting and bringing China back together is what made him such an important figure. And then from there, over the years, through successive dynasties, they would come one after another, and they would cyclically rise and fall. And you can kind of see this illustrated here on this graph. But even by just looking at this graph, you already see that there's some variance. You can see some will last a little longer. You can see the peaks relative economic power are higher on some of them than others. So these are all factors which kind of would complicate things. Clearly, there are different things going on in each of these dynasties, which are affecting both their duration and their height. And while this isn't focused on too heavily in the West, in China, this is history that they study very, very deeply. And by understanding the way they view it, it also helps to understand the concepts they bring to bear with their government today. One way to look at it is if there had been 5 Americas existing in the same continental bounds, and it was roughly the same group of people, they shared a language, they shared like some shared ideals, a shared religion potentially. You could imagine that the government today, when they're making their decisions, they can't simply say, oh, we're going to try this because we don't really know whether it will work, but we have no evidence it won't work. In that situation where there have been 4 Americas in the past, you can imagine that if you're going about doing something which has already been proven in the past to lead to failure, whether it's overtaxing people, whether it's allowing the infrastructure to fall into disrepair, well, at that moment, it's very obvious to the citizenry the parallels. It's so clear. It's the same river that whenever it fell into disrepair 4 times before, the country fell into turmoil. When you have people, large amounts of people unemployed, when you have inflation is something that China has understood for 5,000 years, I think, or sorry, 4,000, 3,000 years. While it's something that a lot of younger Americans might just be hearing about for the first time. These dynasties, one concept which is also important to understand here is the concept of me plugging in my computer because it's going to die, and also the concept of Tian. So you might have heard people discuss the mandate of heaven. So this is an idea which is maybe taken in the West not quite correctly. That heaven is essentially, the mandate of heaven is essentially the idea that the ruling leader of the country is endowed with the right to rule, but also the responsibility that comes with ruling. Now, when this is translated into English, let me just move this, see better. So when this is translated into English, it's translated to mean heaven. But the word Tian, the character word Tian, it goes a bit further than that, because what it more describes is the cyclical pattern of the universe. So, for example, you can see that Tian is also used to describe day. So if I'm talking about today, it's Jin Tian. If I'm talking about tomorrow, it'd be Ming Tian. Duo Tian is yesterday. But then you also have it used in the seasons as well. So summer, winter, you can see it's used to describe weather. All these elements, which really describe the clockwork nature of everything harmonizing and everything working. And it's also the sky. So if you almost imagine it's like you're looking up at the sky, and that itself is a constantly turning machine, and everything kind of has its place under that sky. The emperor's role in that system is to help keep order like among the people, but at the same time, it's not just a role he has to rule over them. He also owes an obligation to them. So whenever you see the dynasties coming into these weak periods when the government starts to fall into these traps, it's actually the situation where they would feel that the mandate of heaven is being lost. It's being taken away at that point. And if you go back to the history, the longer history, so I'll pull up just a timeline, Chinese dynasties. And there's lots of these you can find. So this is a good one. It's a good looking one right here. So this one goes back to the Han Dynasty. But if you're going back even, so this image does, but if you're going back even further, you can go all the way back to the the Xia dynasty, where they're not even quite sure if it exists. And then before that, you get like the Yellow Emperor. That was the Huangdi Emperor that I mentioned. And the concept of the mandate of heaven, it actually comes from the transition period when the Shang turned into the Zhou dynasty. And there was a speech given, and essentially the country was in chaos. It was in a situation where peasants were roaming around. There was disorder. There was natural disasters occurring, but also occurring because they weren't being managed correctly. So to understand natural disasters, it's important to also remember that the management of the rivers, the floodgates, the berms, these things would all actually prevent or at least mitigate the damages of natural disasters. And if you're a farmer and your livelihood is on the land and the river overflows the berm because it's not being well repaired by which you can only do with a strong central government. A single person would never be able to go out and repair that berm. So when the river overflows, it's evidence that, oh, they haven't been holding up their end of the contract, of the bargain. And it was this speech that was given when the Shang dynasty was falling into this chaos by the leader who would overthrow them. And he said, this is not something, in essence, he said, this is not something that I have decided for myself. This has already been decided, as evidenced by the situation we're in. The heaven is fallen into disarray. It's out of order. And what we are here to do is not anything even personally for me or personally against the existing emperor. It is just to restore the balance, which is calling to be restored. So with this background in mind, as we move forward, I think you'll notice some very strong parallels to what we saw happening in the 18th and 19th centuries. So while I said some dynasties would reach this point earlier and some would reach it later, you can see with the Yuan dynasty, for example, this was the Mongol-led dynasty. They peaked far lower and ended much sooner. But even this amount of nuance might already be getting beyond what you would get from a typical Western Cliff Notes history. It was under circumstances like this that a young peasant rose up, and that was the first Ming emperor, who again reunified China after the Mongols were defeated. But most of what took place in the Ming dynasty is typically glossed over as well, and Western tellings of Chinese history typically rush through it to get to the Qing dynasty, because with the Qing dynasty, you then get into what they like to talk about, which is what they would make you believe is the first real Western contacts with China. And that would be the McCartney mission. So if someone was like interested in learning about this, they might find themselves searching. So here we have Encyclopedia Britannica, which might be pretty apt. So the McCartney Embassy was a group of British, I guess you could call them diplomats. They were dispatched by the Queen, and their role, sorry, actually the King at that time, and their role was to open up China to their Western demands to trade with them. When they arrived, they were rebuffed, and the history you'll usually get was that the mission, we'll read it, the mission was marked by a series of misunderstandings between the British and the Chinese. The Qing state ultimately rejected all the British requests, an outcome that would prove to be one of the factors that contributed to the beginning of the Opium Wars in the 19th century. A lot of focus in this is put on an issue of the kowtow question. So during this mission to China, and this is a detail that the Western histories really like to stick onto. McCartney was on the boat, and they were being brought to go see the emperor. This was after a couple of attempts, and the question arose that what would be the formal procedure when he met the emperor, and he was informed that he would be expected to kowtow, which would be to basically go down on your knees and touch your forehead to the ground. And that was just basically the common practice. This is one of those trees in this garden, which is held up as one of the key elements that they want you to kind of glue onto and think about. And as I go through this stuff, I know some of you might know some of this, but I'm just trying to get everyone up to a more basic, like the typical Western understanding, if you've kind of dug into this stuff a little bit, but not necessarily gone maybe as deep as I've found myself going. So for this kowtow, I want to find out, there's some good picture. So as the history goes, he negotiated, and in the end, he did a modified one knee kowtow. The idea behind this, the idea with this, is that he was kind of locked in a battle of egos with the emperor. And this is another focus they have. They like to focus on the historical elements that involve emotion, that involve situations where people's pride is hurt, or where they're enraged, so they act in a certain way, because they want you to feel, in my opinion, like the flow of history is really just based on people's momentary whims and how they're feeling at that exact moment. So presenting the emperor in this way makes it seem as though they simply lacked the ability to comprehend how backwards they were. And as we kind of saw in that Encyclopedia Britannica page a little bit, they say that this attitude and the kind of the continuation of this type of interaction was what would then lead eventually to the well-meaning British, who were doing their very best to implore the Chinese to see reason and adopt free trade, which would obviously allow them to modernize. I mean, at this time, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations had already been out for almost 20 years. So they must have been aghast that the Chinese hadn't picked up a copy yet. But try as they might, we're given the impression that the Chinese simply weren't able to grasp this type of scientific concept, like the invisible hand. And despite all they thought they knew about their own history, it was really just trade, specifically free trade with the British, that they'd been missing. But because they couldn't recognize that when the Opium War eventually ensued, it almost leads some people, and I've seen these kind of arguments even on Twitter, they'll kind of say, well, the Opium War was wrong, and opium is definitely a sexy sort of topic, right? It's like, it's very so it's a drug, it's kind of, it sounds so risque, grabs your attention, similar to the idea, the nice story of the kowtow. But turns out there was actually a lot more going on at that time. And although they make it seem like the British were able to just walk in and trounce China in these situations, it, like with the garden, would lead you to surmise, when you're imagining in your head what this landscape looks like, that there was nothing else prior, or else why are most people beginning here? Well, if you actually look into it, this was far from China's first contact with the West. In fact, even the Romans made contact with China. And you can kind of learn a bit about that on Wikipedia. And I think a lot of people find that quite interesting. There's a famous picture that I'm trying to find here. This was the Romans. Picture's kind of or it's in here somewhere. That was the Romans showing up to China. It looks similar to the last picture we saw, but wait a second. This would have been 1,000 years before the British. In Henry Kissinger's book on China, though, none of this is mentioned. I've read that book, and it basically starts with making you assume that the McCartney mission is the very first mission. But there's something else too, and that would be the issue of Macau. So if you look at Macau and you look at the history of Macau, this is often not talked about, and that's also by design to some extent, because again, this really it challenges a lot of that official narrative. So Macau and the first Portuguese contacts was in the 1500s. And when the Portuguese showed up, initially, they had hoped that they would simply be able to use military force and take land on Macau. But in this situation, and this is hundreds of years prior to the British showing up, it didn't work out that way. The Ming Dynasty, who was ruling at the time, and this is how long ago it was actually the previous dynasty, they were able to defeat them fairly easily, and they sailed away. Eventually, they came back, and to kind of cover for what they had done, they actually claimed that the prior people who the Ming had fought off weren't the Portuguese at all. That was the Franks. We're the Portuguese. We're different. And the Ming said, okay, you guys seem peaceful, but you'll have to pay if you want to use some of our land. So the deal was reached, and there was a price denominated in silver, a rent that the Portuguese would pay to China every single year, just for the privilege of having Macau as a base of operations. And it did benefit them to some degree. And now they had some schemes going on in the background, which didn't play out in the end, but they were friendly to China partly because they were kind of forced. They tried the physical might option. It didn't really work. And there's an interesting story here, actually, where when the Dutch showed up, the Dutch wanted to oust the Portuguese from Macau. So they showed up, and the people on Macau were able to actually fight them off. This was in the 1600s. And after the Dutch sailed away in defeat, the Chinese officials came, and they were surprised. This was a strange thing for them to imagine, because as they saw it, Macau was still their sovereign territory. They would have obviously expected that it would have fallen on them to defend it. So the fact that their tenants actually fought off these intruders really impressed them, and they actually gave rewards. They gave beer. They gave monetary rewards to the people, including a lot of actually black slaves who were on Macau. Were all given beer and financial rewards by the Chinese officials, who were quite happy that they helped out with that. But the Dutch weren't done. They sailed up the coast, and they decided, okay, well, we're not going to fight the Portuguese like that. That's not seeming to go well for us. So they decided instead what they would do is fight the Chinese themselves. So They first sailed to, so here you see the Dutch were defeated by the Portuguese in 1622. And they decided they would go to the port of Xiamen. Xiamen is basically on the mainland opposite of Taiwan. But when they showed up, they were repulsed out. I think they did a little attack, but then it didn't work out so well. So they settled on some islands very close by, but they had some Chinese on it, I believe, but there was no other foreigners there. It was at this point just Macau, and they thought so. This would be where they were, right here, and they had thought that here they would be able to set up their own base of operations, but they didn't have any intent to pay rent or ask permission to be there. Well, the Ming Army, the Ming Navy, obviously weren't okay with that, but they did recognize that the Dutch had some impressive ships. It was nothing like what they had in China. These were double-decker ships. So there was a row of guns and another row of guns on the top. And what the Ming Navy had at that time, it's just you're dealing with double the firepower from the same ships. So they recognized that a head-on conflict would be pretty difficult. So what they did, though, was they took a note of what the Dutch ships, what they looked like, what capabilities they had, and in a short period of time, I believe less than a couple of years, they built replicas of the Dutch ships, but in a Chinese style. So they built these giant ships, which the Dutch themselves reported were basically matched or exceeded their abilities. I believe it was in one direction of wind. The Chinese were even faster than the Dutch. So they built these ships, and when they sailed into the port harbor, right, where the Dutch were trying to establish their unwanted settlement, they saw these ships loom in. But what happened next, I think, is really interesting. So during this encounter, the fleet, so this is the Ming admiral, they engaged the Dutch warships. They were allied by 50 junks as well, and there were even Chinese pirates who were helping them out as well. But he had just built these fantastic ships. These ships were nicer. Like there's a Dutch quote somewhere where they said that they believed they were actually nicer than their own ships. But imagine the Dutch's surprise when these ships sailed in one morning out of the mist. But as they came towards the Dutch ships, they didn't stop. They just kept coming. And the Dutch might have maybe been thinking the Chinese must not know how to operate these ships. They've done a good job copying them, but clearly they're not operating them correctly. Well, the plan was never even to use them. Although they were fully functional, they didn't even want to engage in that kind of a battle because they didn't expect they would ever need these ships again. They built them for this one situation to deal with the Dutch. They weren't planning to go out and emulate the Dutch and do what the Dutch themselves did, going long distances with these large ships, pulling into under-equipped ports and basically exerting their might on them. They didn't need these ships after. They just used them to match the Dutch and get rid of them. So the ships kept coming, and then at the last second, so the Dutch were obviously panicking. There's stories they were trying to cut the mooring ropes because it wasn't even time to untie them. They didn't know what to do. The sailors, the Chinese sailors, jumped off of these brand new ships, and they set them on fire, and they actually basically turned them into giant fire ships. And it destroyed a large number of ships in that Dutch fleet. They left, and if you've ever heard that the Dutch had a colony on what is now Taiwan, formerly called by the Dutch Formosa, That was actually why they ended up there. It was because they had tried twice, both times failed. Eventually, they went to the island now called Taiwan, where they stayed for a little while and then they had to leave. So in this context now, the decision of the emperor, it doesn't seem so cut and dry anymore. His interpretation that he didn't want to engage in trade with the British, there's a famous letter that he actually wrote, which the British will often point to as evidence of the Chinese arrogance when they tell their version of the history. Qianlong Emperor, that was the emperor's name. And it was King George III. And this is a pretty fantastic letter. So he said, you, O king, from afar, have yearned after the blessings of our civilization, and in your eagerness to come into touch with our converting influence, have sent an embassy across the sea bearing a memorial. I have already taken note of your respectful spirit of submission. I've treated your mission with extreme favor. When he sent them back, he sent them with lots of gifts. And at some point, one of the mandarins admitted that the gifts are kind of, we don't feel we owe you them, but they're a polite way of us telling you, please leave. But he didn't want anything back from them. He said that they possess all things, which was a line that the British were quite incensed by, especially since these free trade missions. It's really important to keep in mind the free trade is just as much, if not more, about getting markets for British production to actually sell into. Today we see China as a producer, but at that time it wasn't quite like that. At that time, the British, they were the ones manufacturing the most goods. Their idea for free trade was just as much about getting new markets to sell to. So obviously, you can imagine this would really rub them the wrong way. They didn't like the end where he said, tremblingly obey, but there are translational errors there, and scholars have said that this is actually pretty polite when you look at the kind of language that the emperor would typically use. So, chased away, the British came back. The opium wars ensued, and the stress this put the government under ultimately weakened them to the point where they, over time, they lost their ability to control the territory. And as that happened, the Cliff Notes version goes, eventually people got fed up and they yearned after the ideas from the West. They wanted to reproduce what was in the West, in China. And in 1911, the final Qing emperor was overthrown. It was a 3 or 4 year old boy named Puyi, and he would be the last emperor. 1911 is the date officially given for the end. So there we go. We have a little background, but now let's see how that compares when we actually look at a primary source from the time. So what I'm going to pull up is something, it's a paper. This was published in, I believe, 1926 by the Round Table Journal. And Matt, I'd hope that if you could just really quickly, for anyone who doesn't know what the Round Table Journal is, just provide like maybe a little background of what they kind of represent.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's super important and very much underappreciated. So I'll just, for those who don't know, the Roundtable movement, which I go through in the Untold History of Canada, Volume 4, in some pretty good detail, and also some of the material in Volume 2 of The Clash of the Two Americas, is the name given to the Cecil Rhodes Milner secret society that was set up with the money bequeathed to a trust by Cecil Rhodes, who himself was an agent of the Gascoigne Cecil faction of the British Empire, and professed to launch a reorganization of the British civil service and British organizational thinking more generally, faced with the spread of nationalist progressive movements vectored around progress, development, technological leaps outside of limits to growth that was spreading due to Lincoln's victory and the success of the American system at the end of the 19th century. So nations around the world were accepting this new way of doing political economy outside of the British mandate of being obedient to free trade and the British East India Company's dominance of the world. So the empire was losing its control, and the Roundtable was one of the core organizations that did sort of a reorganization of the empire itself, to keep it alive. And so one of the ways that was selected was, on the one hand, where there's a threefold approach. On the one hand, a network of think tanks was created to organize the various elite parties who were working with Milner in different parts of the Anglo-Saxon countries with a focus on reconquering the United States. The way that they would coordinate, and the other way was through the Rhodes Scholarship Brainwashing Trust Fund, that would find talent and indoctrinate young talent in the halls of Oxford to be redeployed back into different parts of the Commonwealth, in order to bring about a new global British Empire. And finally, the Roundtable magazine, was sort of the way to coordinate grand strategy to get everybody on the same page in a relatively efficient manner internationally. So that's what I would say about the Roundtable magazine.
Yeah, perfect. I appreciate that. So I thought that this would be a good place to look when I was kind of trying to better understand this period, because the period of time after 1911 to 1949, when the Communist Party of China took over, is a period of time where there's very little history. And this brings me back to my analogy at the beginning, where when the history isn't favorable to most players, it's almost as if you get quite a barren period of time. It becomes a void. And that's what I really kept seeing when I was trying to understand more. So I figured I'll see if the Roundtable journal, which they were putting out these periodicals, and this basically reflected their current thinking at the moment on the British position, as Matt said, and their strategy to go about dealing with it. Now, what's interesting, and this is how you know that I am not just being hyperbolic, this has been online since I think 2008 here. 13 views, 13 people have taken advantage of this and actually taken a look. So this was when I talked to Matt before, this was one of the first things I kind of was showing him. So something's going on when they're writing this. They're clearly concerned. They have Hong Kong. It's ostensibly their colony, but something's threatening it. Now, I was under the impression, from the typical understanding of history, that the Chinese were very weak. They wouldn't have probably been posing much of a threat to the British at this time. But we can see that there was a threat. It was a very real threat. So I'll read. So they say, two main factors in the Chinese problem especially concern us: the insistent and natural claim of a reawakened China to a revision of the attitude of the West towards her, and the menace to British interests. So clearly, they actually were posing some sort of a threat. This article deals only with the second, but that does not mean that the first factor can be left out of account. It is indeed at the root of the trouble in the Far East, and the need for putting our relations with China on a new basis has already been emphasized in these pages. The danger to our position is, however, so grave a character in the South that it is essential that the public should realize what is happening there. And it concerns the Americans, French, the Japanese, as well as ourselves. Or to judge from the words of a high Kuomintang official, which are quoted below, what is our turn today may be theirs tomorrow, which is essentially them saying the position or the power, something they have now, they're scared, and they're scared it will go to a Chinese government, which is interesting way they see things. So just continuing. So we understand there's a boycott going on. And again, more new information here. They're saying boycotts are not a new weapon in China's armory. We have from the old John Company records that in the days of the Canton factories, whole fleets were not infrequently detained, swinging idly at their moorings for months at a time. But why were they detained? They were forbidden to load their valuable cargoes of tea, silk, and Turkey rhubarb. In other words, the ships weren't being forcibly detained. China was just cutting them off. And although they were forced to sign the unequal treaties and whatnot, which characterize what most people would consider the Chinese century of humiliation story, in reality, despite the treaties, that didn't actually mean that the people themselves weren't willing to take action. Pending the settlement of some dispute between the Chinese officials and the company's agents, while the boycott's first cousin, closed the shops, is now and always the Chinese merchants' most effective protest in the face of illegal impost or tyranny, it is only during the present century the Chinese have come to realize the efficacy of the boycott as a retaliatory measure. So, in essence, they were, just as they were willing to burn their ships, you can draw a parallel, they're just as willing to hurt themselves for a short period of time, to not sell their wares, to actually pass up that opportunity to earn money if they feel that there's some kind of grievance that's affecting them. Again, this is very different from the more impotent version of China we're kind of fed today in the typical stories. So they just say here how when Japan proposed their 21 demands, which was something Japan asked from China as part of their gradual moving in on China themselves, they're saying how that spurred a boycott in the past. But they also reveal something here. They say the impact of the West upon China and its inevitable results were already described in the roundtable. However, to the affair of May 30th, 1925 at Shanghai, when a collision took place between the police of the international settlement and an excited mob, a number of Chinese, among them several students, were killed and wounded. This was followed by a violent anti-foreign outburst, accompanied by a general strike. So, May 30th, 1925, it appears that these were British police who were involved in the shooting in Shanghai, and that was what triggered the initial onset of this boycott situation. But as they've kind of described, it's something that has been reoccurring at a more frequent rate. So they're just giving some background here. And they're now picking it up again, and they're saying the shooting incident at Shanghai had started to die down, and they were hoping things would get better, because essentially this boycott, although it might have happened, like the incident happened in Shanghai, it was picked up all across the country. So that they were holding out hope that this would be able to die down. The labor unions were a big part of this, and they were the ones actually organizing a sympathetic strike, which would start in Canton and Swatow, which is right beside Hong Kong, and it was supposed to be on June 23rd. So this is where we get to the Xiamen incident, and this is one of those big things which it's completely left out of what anyone will usually tell you. The Xiamen itself is a small island. I'll show, which it's not Hong Kong. It's near Hong Kong. This is a historic photo here. So it was in the Pearl River. On one side, there was a river. There was this narrow body of water, and it was separating it. The whole thing was 0.3 square miles, and there were some bridges. And this was completely dominated half by the British, half by the French. And they controlled the access to the island. So you couldn't get there without being admitted through. So when this protest was designed, it was planned to have students march in a procession and march alongside like that riverway, and at the end they would come up alongside the bridge path. So let me see. Sorry for scrolling around a bunch. I'm just getting to the exact moment. So they're kind of setting it up, and it says such was the procession on the afternoon of June 23rd, which made its way along Shakai Street, the busy thoroughfare of the city, running parallel with the Xiamen and separated from it by a narrow creek. With the protesters, there were also some military cadets, and military cadets were able to carry their rifles with them as well when they were doing this. These cadets, fully armed, arrived opposite the Victoria Hotel on the Xiamen. Several shots rang out from the Shakai side, and some disorder was discernible among their ranks. A moment later, they turned and fired deliberately across the creek of the Xiamen, killing a French merchant and wounding 3 civilians, one of whom a woman. There were the French and British Marines guarding the concession returned fire with machine guns, and a sharp fusillade ensued. So they're wording it here in a way which kind of makes it seem like there was a bit of a fault on both sides. They say there were a few further minor casualties. British petty officer was shot in the hands. So other than that French merchant, someone got shot in the hands. Of the processionists, though, the British report said that 37 of these students were killed, including 1 woman, 4 students, a teacher of the Canton Christian College, and about 80 wounded. But they admit the Chinese accounts of the occurrence, the number of both killed and wounded was considerably higher. Now, they tried to put forth the story that the Chinese side was the ones who shot first, but that didn't seem to go over very well. No one on the Chinese side believed that. And that was when they miraculously came upon the evidence that there must have been 2 Russians who were bribed to discharge their rifles near the procession with the object of provoking the collision that occurred. And they make very clear that it's only anti-British newspapers that are printed in English but must be supported by Russian money, which are promoting the story that it was the British and the French who shot first. Despite that, though, they do admit that some American and British professors did agree that it was the French and British side who shot first. And they have a lovely quote here where they say, the stream of returning strikers to Hong Kong ceased instantly. So essentially, at the time of the strike, a large portion, 40% of people in Hong Kong left. So when we see today, and Hong Kong is really very much shown to be very separate from China. That's the idea they want to put forward, and they want to put forward that the people have a very separate identity. You can see at this time in history, they were in complete solidarity, and they were kind of trickling back like to work in Hong Kong, but now they're saying they stopped instantly. They were so upset, no one wanted to go back to Hong Kong after this happened. And the lovely quote I mentioned is, they say that to the Chinese, any kind of cry against imperialism and unequal treaties probably conveyed little meaning. But the shooting of a number of their compatriots, that provided enough concrete evidence of foreign brutality that even their intelligence could easily grasp. So that kind of shows how positively they think of the Chinese. So this is where we kind of take three strings in this article that we can pull on. The first was kind of understanding this incident a little bit further. So if you try to look it up, you'll see we hear a whole lot about 1989 massacres, but the coverage here you get is considerably briefer. They admit somewhere that several hundred people were reported to have been killed. This monument itself was actually so forgotten about that it was taken away and then put back when a highway was moved. But you would expect now that, at least in China, they would likely have a better understanding of this. Well, what you can do is, if you change the language, you can just copy the title there, right? Then I'll go to the Chinese version of their equivalent to Wikipedia. And if you type it in, you can see the amount of coverage they give it. This is it. So for all they will hear about the potential of there being a 1989 student massacre, which I think Matt has done a really good job exposing as basically a color revolution hoax. Whenever something actually happens to them, their coverage is considerably smaller. They probably hear a lot more about the hoax than they know about an actual event which occurred. And Matt also in the past, I'm sure you guys have seen, he's shown in his article, the Tiananmen Square hoax dossier, he's shown the photos of what happened at Tiananmen Square. Well, if you look, here we actually get photos, and these people, they look like they were probably actually students, or at the very least young people. Here they are. Here's the sandbags that were erected across from the bridge. These are those cadets I mentioned. The Whampoa Military Academy, which is right nearby, that was basically the premier Canadian Chinese military college. So that's where those cadets would be coming from. And there's a good photo in here of you see just more students, and I can pull it up. There's a photo of people marching. So you can see the rally. So see, this is what they were describing. You have people, they're marching along, and these would have been the people who were open fired upon. And you saw that dead guy there. He was wearing the exact same outfit as those guys who are marching. So yeah, that was the first kind of thread in that article to pull on. But the second one is even, I think this is the one where we really get into the economics of everything. So as I was reading through this, I noticed something towards the end. And it's where they begin talking about their concern when it comes to like a monetary concern. And they say that in 1924, Hong Kong's share of the 113 million pounds, which represented the value of British trade with China, was no less than 70 million. So we're getting actual numbers here, which they're trying to explain what the impact is on them. But I found it very refreshing to see actual real numbers, where often you'll just get kind of vague stuff when you're looking at sources in typical history books. They won't actually tell you what's really going on behind the scenes. But they say that beyond just this money in this trade, they say that this is one of the more serious aspects of the situation. For trade deflected in this way, they talk about trade which instead of going to Hong Kong might go somewhere else, and it will be difficult to recover. And if this state of affairs continues much longer, Britain's commercial preeminence in the Far East will be a thing of the past. And I'm like, why do they have a little note here, right there? So if you look, they say, an example of the way in which British prestige would be affected should this happen is that in February 1898, the Chinese Foreign Office gave an undertaking to the British government that the Inspector General of the Chinese Maritime Customs is to be a British subject as long as British trade predominates in China. Now, like I read this at first, and then I thought for a second, and I realized, wait a second, this was written in 1926. They're talking about a promise they were given by the Qing Dynasty, which we talked about, right? We're supposed to believe that was gone in 1911, but here we have them worried that a deal they made with the Qing Dynasty for the British to have some kind of special privilege in China could be at risk if their volume of trade drops significantly. So how does that make sense if we're to understand that the Qing Dynasty is gone? Well, the answer to that question is in digging into what they actually mean by the Inspector General of the Chinese Maritime Customs is to be a British subject as long as British trade. What is the Chinese Maritime Customs then? So first what I did was I was just like, oh, I'm looking it up, and I was confused. I'm like, this is the Kuomintang's flag. You might recognize it today as the flag which is used to represent Taiwan sometimes. And I was like, oh, there's agency executives. And as I was reading it, and I'm getting close to 1950, I started to get very confused. I'm like, wait a second, you're telling me there was an agency headed by the British in China, active, clearly important to them in some way, and it was active not only well prior to the establishment of what we're to believe is the Republic of China power period in China, but right up until the communists took over. Well, when you understand what the Chinese Maritime Customs Service actually is, it can also make sense of some other incidents which otherwise would be a little confusing. So if you've ever heard, has anyone ever heard of the Amethyst incident? So I came across this, I was on Audible and I was looking for some book to listen to on China. And it's an incident where this British warship was navigating down one of China's rivers. And during the Chinese Civil War, right towards the end of it, 1949, it was deep in one of the rivers, and the communist troops shot at this boat. And the British were quite upset about that. Why was this boat down a Chinese river in 1950? That's something that doesn't really make sense unless you understand the Chinese Maritime Customs Service. So I have found a book that was written by a researcher who himself was pretty shocked by what he found. So what do we see here? The Chinese Maritime Customs Service was an institution that for over 80 years held an integral role in facilitating foreign trade along the China coast and waterways. Established as the Imperial Maritime Customs Service in the wake of China's defeat in the Opium Wars, it becomes a central feature of the treaty port system. This British-dominated service also encompassed other responsibilities such as harbor maintenance, lighthouse service, quarantine, anti-piracy patrols. Okay, that's a bit strange. I mean, like those things sound fairly innocuous. Piracy patrols, lighthouses. It doesn't sound quite so nefarious, but it's still quite confusing. It is common knowledge that during the past 8 or 9 decades, the quasi-British controlled Inspectorate of Customs has hitherto been a cornerstone of British position in China and has been co-equal with the name of England herself in the Far East. And it should be considered furthermore that the influence and prestige of the Inspectorate General, this is what they were worried about. Remember in the Roundtable Journal, they were saying, we don't want to lose that position. Throughout this period was attained and sustained solely by individual exertions. This was Sir Frederick May's 21st of December, 1943. So reading these little blurbs, these little quotes, it's kind of more questions than answers at this point. From its inception in the 1850s, so this would have been right following the first Opium War. So notice how I mentioned this before, they'll pick out the most interesting sounding little like bites. Like they'll be like, oh, that he didn't want to kowtow to the emperor. The Opium War, the British came and they fought them because the Chinese wouldn't accept their opium. But then after that, they did accept it. Problem resolved. Well, in reality, that first Opium War gave way to something that was far more impactful on China than just opium. But only they want you to mainly just focus on the opium part and be like, oh, that was a bit bad. But no, it gets a lot better than that. From its inception in the 1850s, the Imperial Maritime Customs Service was uniquely cosmopolitan, dominated by British nationals, stretching along the China coast and penetrating inland along waterways. The service represented a vast network of over 40 customs stations. So a station would be associated with a city. So to get an idea of what this actually would look like, if you're imagining like a whole series of them. we know about Shanghai, we know about Hong Kong. How much more are there? Well, we're told there's 40. So this cartoon starts to make a bit of sense. This, by the way, is a very interesting website. They have a lot of unique history. I found some of the stuff that I'm talking about today on this site. I think it's just run by volunteers. This is their idea of China being cut up, but we see the evolution of these treaty ports. So a little sun would represent a treaty port. So it started here. Then we moved to 1850, right? There's a few more. And as you go, you see almost like just like cancer tumors. They're just popping up one by one. This is 1920, and I believe that's as far as this goes. I don't think they added any more after that point. So you can see that when you imagine a treaty port, sorry, my Siri just activated. When you imagine a treaty port, you might imagine just on the coast, but as you can see, it goes right up the rivers. That Amethyst boat was traversing between two of them, down one of the rivers near, I think it was Wuhan, whenever that incident occurred. So they have more than 40 stations, but they say here that not only were they just collecting these customs revenues, but they were also monitoring and regulating foreign trade with China. Its influence reached even beyond just tariffs and trade, ensuring its survival into the uncertain years of the early republic and beyond. So the reason this organization initially appeared was after the First Opium War. The British then informed the ruling emperor that they owed them money back for the military expedition that they had launched against them. It was a fairly common practice they would do. They call it reparations often. But the situation in China had been now thrown into a bit of chaos. And this is like that chaos we talked about before. And in this chaos, it would be difficult, the British claimed, for the Chinese to guarantee that they would be able to pay this money back to them. So that was fine. They were willing to help them out. They said, one of our banks will give you guys a loan. The loan can be the loan to us. So in other words, we'll loan you the money to pay us. You can pay back the bank collateral. You can pay them over time until the loan is paid off, obviously with interest as well. But we need to know that you guys will be able to actually pay this. So we will help you administer like a tariff system, and that can be a source of revenue for you. So with each of these customs houses, essentially what they would do is they would assess a fee on any goods that came in and out. So now, again, it's often talked about lighthouses, harbor maintenance, etc. But when you realize that they were controlling a significant amount of the government's revenue and taking a big chunk out of the money, like the value from any good that flowed past them, I don't think lighthouses are necessarily the most important thing when it comes to understanding them. So here we see the last kind of quote, which is a bit mysterious, where they say, the service, the international nature of the service is given prominence in rights work. Its international duties ranging international duties, range of interests, and ideals of public service are the reasons why the service has been termed a precursor to the League of Nations. Although this was certainly a grand comparison, and Wright was quick to emphasize that the service was only a Chinese service, he did stress that it still was a cosmopolitan and indeed had benefited every nation on earth that had dealings with China. Here's this: for over 80 years, the service stood as a signpost on the road to international understanding and cooperation in a world to be purged from the evil aggressiveness of perverted nationalism. The example and experience of the Chinese Customs Service indicate inspiring possibilities for the future. So these people seem to be very happy about what they're doing. And we can see here, they go a bit more into the origins. As I said, they were created following the Opium Wars. They said that they needed them essentially to guarantee that they would be paid back. And this is where they go into that. They say the overthrow of the Taiping did not, however, mark the end of difficulties for the beleaguered Qing court. Other rebellious groups sprang up. The disruption to trade led to the foreign powers to look to alternatives to Chinese administration of trade in the treaty ports. They sought some way of enforcing control over the existing Chinese customs system. So this is the timeline of all of them being opened here. So you had Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, Xiamen, Guangdong, and then as the years came, they just kept coming, and that's where you get that image we looked at earlier. So ostensibly, their role was to collect these tariffs. They would retain what they needed for the upkeep of the service, and then following that, once they had paid for the service, they should have been passing it on to the government. But we can see when we actually look at the data that didn't last very long. So in the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, in the ensuing peace protocol of 1901, the treaty powers again claimed reparations for their losses. And this was where these indemnities were secured against customs revenue after paying for the upkeep of the service itself. Tariffs were set at 5%. This setting of tariffs guaranteed the service revenue, but at the same time benefited traders and disadvantaged the Chinese government as they couldn't adjust any of their tariffs over time. So we see now that it's not just for upkeep, it's for indemnities and loans. And this explains my confusion. In the years following the 1911 revolution, the political situation in China was significantly disturbed. So now we're talking about after the fall of the Qing dynasty. As a result, revenues were placed in the respective commissioners' hands as the imperial officials had fled from their posts. The inspector general then assumed responsibility for these revenues. A loans and indemnity service was then administered from Shanghai. Hence, until well into the 1920s, the revenues from the Chinese Customs Service were directed into foreign banks. This was justified in the CMCS as protecting revenue. But in essence, they were, at this point, without the government, completely in control of all the tax revenue centrally of a country which no longer had a strong government. So you quickly realize it would be of great benefit to the British for this period of time to have no cohesive leadership, to have people fragmented and in disarray. The desire for tariff autonomy and control, they say here, was one of the platforms adopted as the Chinese were trying to nationalize. So there's some data in here, though, which is even more interesting. It's on page 50. This is their structure. So you can see with this whole system active, right? 40 plus customs houses. This is every main city has one of these offices in it. They have a whole hierarchy of command within that. And any goods traveling on the waterways. Later on, there was some built inland, and it was any kind of land-based commerce that moved past them. All of that was going to get this 5% tariff in and out from the entire economy. And it was after the fall of the Qing Dynasty in 1911, the management was entrusted to a British bank. So, page 50, I believe. So what did this actually mean? So in 1929, right, and at this time, although they were very weak, they would still claim that, oh, there's still a government of China. It's called the Republic of China. So theoretically, these would be what their tax revenues would be. 41% of it would be accounted for by the Customs Service, this British-controlled entity. 6.8% salt taxes, which were also administered by a foreign cabal. So basically, one way you can guarantee you can get wealth out of a group of people as they're just getting poorer and poorer is to say, well, they need salt to survive. So if we put a tax on salt and we can just corner the market with a monopoly, they'll find the way to pay it one way or another. Otherwise, they'll die. So the salt monopoly was born out of that. And then beyond that, there's no other significant sources of revenue for the government. In one year, they had a small cash balance. But if you look at the consolidated numbers, like it's pretty much adding up to 100%. The only other thing they did as well was occasionally take out some loans. So when we talked about the reparation that they had to pay and how that was used as one excuse to take money out of the customs, right? That wasn't the only loan. It turns out there's a whole list of loans that were being taken out under some degree of coercion, convincing the Chinese government that the only way they could obviously get anything from the West at this point, right, now that their economy was so weakened, they would need foreign currency. Well, they were willing to lend them that foreign currency, and that's where you get all of these loans. Now, you'll notice when they do the loans, they want to be paid back in gold, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what they're going to be giving the Chinese when they take out the loan. So this is where another really interesting pattern starts to take shape. So you can actually see where this customs service, now we know it's pretty important. Like this isn't 5% of government revenue, this is like around 50, 60%. So these numbers actually hold a lot of weight. So the import duty versus the export duty, they were making, as time went on, and you can see the ratio continued to skew, they're making about 10 times in 1933 more money from import duties than export duties. So while today we really tend to see China as a factory of the world, as an exporting nation, right? A nation with big trade surpluses. At this time, it was the exact opposite. China at this time, if anything, resembles in some ways the US today, in my opinion. If you consider they were being viewed as a consumer market as opposed to a producer market. Another parallel today, which I'll just throw in there, which is pretty interesting. This was video taken in 1928 in China. Well, actually, no, this is an ad.
We probably won't be able to hear sound. So is sound important or no?
Oh, yeah, no, yeah, I muted it. Yeah, no, there's no, sound's not important.
Okay.
I really got the non-skippable ads. So this is footage that was taken in 1928. This is right the time period we're talking about in China. We have a puppet show. These are how people were looking like. And you can imagine, right? Looking at those customs data, you can see just year after year, exports were dropping, imports were rising, less and less was being produced. So then what do people do? How do they earn money, right? There was widespread starvation, famines affected tens of millions of people during this period. And there were several, there wasn't just one across various regions. But an interesting parallel to today is you might realize, you might start to notice something. So what do people in the World Economic Forum say, or in certain think tanks talk about? They like to talk about the service-based economy, but then now it's the gig economy that they like to talk about. Well, when you see all these people, right? Rickshaws weren't always a thing like this in China. This was a phenomenon that started to develop around this time. People who couldn't find a regular employment, and they couldn't, like, typically, right, 90% of Chinese people were farmers. They couldn't farm necessarily because with inflation so high, it was difficult for a lot of farmers to get credit, and a lot of their landlords were increasing taxes on them regardless, especially with inflation going up. So the peasants, right, a lot of them would pay their taxes in grain, but if it didn't grow, or if there were shortages, there was no communal projects going on at this time, where there was lots of soil rehabilitation projects, which would usually take place, right? People would all work together to cart in new soil, irrigation projects. None of that's taking place. You have all these people pushed into this economy where the best thing you can do is pull a wagon with somebody on it. And if you think about how we have Uber today, and something else they show in here is people would also deliver water to houses. So it's that became a popular job, was being the person who brought water to somebody's house. You can almost see that like DoorDash or something, in my opinion, at least. And the demand for jobs like that, because there really was nothing less, but you see, or nothing left. But you see, this isn't a remedy, right? The wealth of these people still slowly would decline and decline, because China was more and more reliant. There was less and less they were actually doing, they would have. So today people are very caught up. They see, oh, the US is a consumer economy, but their dollar is very valuable. But that's not necessarily always to be the case, right? China at this time hadn't just been the number one producer. Had they been, maybe they would have had a little period of carryover there. So just checking my notes. And yeah, this is the thing. So in all that footage, right, and up to this point, we would now think, I think most people watching this, you would think, I probably have a pretty good understanding of 1910s, 1920s, 1930s China. But the reality is, even what we've seen so far, we're only seeing what was going on in the cities. The vast majority of the country, 450 million or so people, weren't really mentioned yet. And that is the peasants, right? Like I kind of briefly touched on them, but even in that footage, those were people who had already kind of tried to move to cities. So those were the people who were suffering more and more. And when you look at the emergence, right, of the Communist Party amid these factors, and amid the fact that the nationalist government was having a lot of trouble getting any headway, you can start to see why a great peasant movement would be attractive to people. Now, something that I just wanted to finish on in this Maritimes Customs article. Something else to note, they had a London office for the Maritime Customs. Here's a quote where the guy was specifically told this was the person who was going to be the head of it for a period of time. He was told not to promote it, not to talk about it. There's just a few people you should talk to. Your job isn't to make more people aware of the existence of this entity. So it's not by mistake that we haven't heard of it. Even at the time, it was kind of intentional. So this brings me to a period of time in the history of the Customs Service where we see why they would have been not just like imperialism might not have just been a talking point to people in China. So with the Communist Party, a lot of the rhetoric surrounded upon the exploitation of China, the imperialist aggression of China. Well, before the Communist Party really started talking this way as strongly, China had other leaders who were stepping forward, and they wanted to take up the mantle. They thought that the Qing dynasty was going away. This would be a blank slate, and they could maybe employ some ideas that would benefit the country. And then this is where we get a really unique character, which I'm sure a fair number of you might have now heard of, probably because of Matt. So I was wondering, Matt, maybe you could just introduce who Sun Yat-sen is, and what he might have wanted from the Guangzhou Customs, or what his concerns would have been at the very least at this time.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I guess just to be super quick, I think people probably have some familiarity with Sun Yat-sen, who was a devoted follower of Abraham Lincoln and the American system. He wrote several books, and the most important one probably is the Three Principles of the People, as well as the International Development of China. He was the first president of China. He was a Christian and a Confucian, which he didn't see as opposing paradigms, but rather very compatible with each other, as they are. And he recognized that after the Declaration of Independence of China, effectively in 1911, that unless China is able to gain economic sovereignty, that is, develop full control of their banking system modeled on the principles of Abraham Lincoln's American system, then there would be no way to avoid getting reconquered by the British Empire. And he warned about that in several places, especially after World War I. So he tried his best in the way that he could to try to force the warlords and other oligarchs to abide by a higher principle of what he called the principles of peaceful coexistence. Or no, that's what came in later, was the principles of peaceful coexistence through the Bandung Conference, which was an attempt later on to actualize his principles of the people, a nation governed for, by, and of the people. But he wasn't able to get the foothold. He got backstabbed, too many traitors, and it just didn't work out. And then he died a little bit too young, leaving a bit of a leadership vacuum. So I guess with that, that's probably is that a good intro, or you want me to say?
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Okay.
No, that's good. That's good. So, and one piece of this, because I always find now when I'm looking at this history, and it's like we can see actual data points, right? One piece of this is like he was strapped for cash. Like there's the requirement, if you're actually trying to grow a movement, especially if you're being attacked by the neighboring warlords constantly, which he was, you need to actually be able to hire soldiers. You need to hire people. Now, you would think, okay, maybe he could come up with some kind of tax idea to tax people. Well, the situation was they were already, you saw in the video, these people didn't have a lot of money and they were already being taxed heavily by the customs service. Now, ostensibly, this was revenue which was meant to go to the Chinese government. So you would think that Sun Yat-sen stepping forward, they would give him maybe not the entire country's revenue, but come on, at least maybe Guangdong province, like he has so much support there. Or what about just the city of Guangzhou? The trade coming in and out of that was huge. Would they maybe give him that share of the revenue that they're holding at HSBC Bank? Well, not quite. So Sun Yat-sen thought that. He thought that would seem fair. So he asked for a pro rata share of the Guangzhou customs revenue. But in 1923, this actually triggered a rallying of foreign naval forces. Again, completely left out of, you can get Henry Kissinger's On China book. He'll talk about the kowtow, but doesn't mention anything about this. They at first said, oh yeah, maybe, but eventually the loans never materialized, and he ran out of money. It's very difficult to, I guess, also raise a significant amount of money in a service-based economy where more and more people are just trying to do services. Where's the actual like physical money? Like they were using there was silver, there was copper, and then at this period there were bills. But as soon as the bills got introduced, because the economy, there was very little demand for that bill, like the paper currency outside of China, it just started inflating because you're only trusting that it has a value, but there's nothing actually that you can really buy with it without having some kind of more physical dollar, right? If you want to buy like a Western product or a Western good, those are all getting paid for ultimately in the end in some kind of metallic currency. So that's why at that time people talk about a dual currency system in China. There was an actual real good currency for outside trade, and that was what the Western powers wanted. But within China, it was at this time mostly becoming the paper currency. And this is just an amazing quote about, which really explains why Sun Yat-sen was having a hard time. Maybe it's not just, I'm not saying people say he's inept, but even I was thinking, well, maybe he just really could have been better militarily minded. And I do definitely think that would have helped him. But there is also an aspect to it where, as he says here, and this isn't actually him saying this is someone saying this about him, I write in reference to the claim of the southwestern provinces for their share of the customs surplus. There's no doubt that there is ample surplus remaining after the foreign obligations charged on customs revenue are paid, and that at present it goes to pay past debts contracted by Peking. It thus sets free other revenues which are employed by the northern militarists to make war against the Southwest. These warlords we were mentioning. These provinces are then forced to raise funds to meet a tax funded by what are rightly their own money. So the customs revenue from the South was actually going to the customs service. They were redistributing that, and a lot of it they were actually giving to northern warlords who were then coming down and launching these attacks against them. So very clearly, there was an actual physical mechanism in place to stop him. It wasn't just that he maybe didn't have enough support or he just wasn't able to quite rally up troops. There was a whole mechanism engaged to just constantly push him down with his people's own money. They therefore suffer a double loss of funds which should be used for constructive purposes and which, turned over to the northern militarists, are actually used to institute war against them. And loss in that for every one of these dollars employed against them, they have to raise one or more dollars in self-defense. So you see, it's a pretty terrible situation that he found himself in, but very genius in a very evil way. from the British. Such a situation is not only impossible, but also insufferable. It has been tolerated so long already, it obviously cannot be endured any longer. So, as Matt said, Sun Yat-sen, he tried his best. He got backstabbed. He also didn't get money. And that basically, that put on hold his ability to implement some of his visions. As we get into the 1930s, we also should just quickly mention that Japan started playing a larger and larger role. Japan, they had been making their demands. They annexed Korea right around the turn of the century, I believe. So Korea had already basically been taken by Japan. And then Manchuria was next. So that Qing dynasty, they were from Manchuria originally. They weren't ethnically Han Chinese quite the way that the Ming dynasty was formed by a Ming peasant who ended up becoming their first emperor. The Qing dynasty was Manchus from Manchuria. It's the northern area of China on a map, kind of towards the right, right past the Great Wall, actually. So when the Manchus came in and they took over, and they kind of exerted their influence on China, they were doing it in a way where they were always in the back of their head focused on subjugating, to a certain extent, rebels or people who would not want to follow their rule. So when trying to understand why these foreigners were even able to get in so easily and why they were able to make such an inroad that wasn't possible during the Ming dynasty, that I think is one important thing in understanding it. For example, if you've ever seen historic photos of people in China with the long queue hairstyle, that was something the Manchus forced everyone to have. That wasn't something that was part of Chinese culture for generations and generations. It was something they added, and the purpose of it was that Manchus would wear their hair like that, and if you were told you had to, otherwise you'd be severely punished, they could easily root out rebels. It takes a very long time to grow your hair out. You can't just replace that, right? So they felt that was one way to kind of tell if people were getting suspicious. But another thing they did was they prevented any Han Chinese, which is the vast majority of the country, from holding any kind of military positions or any positions of power, but especially military. Well, when we think about those ships that got built, the people involved in doing that, like many of them were Han Chinese. So the Qing dynasty really had, towards the end, at their disposal, still only a fraction of the actual country. And that also helps explain why there was like their peak. It didn't ever reach the high levels that they were able to get in previous dynasties. So Sun Yat-sen, he's gone now. Japanese come in. They go into Manchuria. The Manchus basically get subjugated in that situation, and they start slowly crawling their way down through more and more of China. They rename Manchuria Manchukuo. It's like Manchu country. And that's kind of when more and more sentiment really starts to build in China. People are quite upset about the situation that they're in, and they're looking for a way out. And the nationalists, you might wonder, so if Sun Yat-sen had this problem, right? Sun Yat-sen couldn't find money. How did the nationalists last so long? How did they go to Taiwan? Well, what they were able to do was when Chiang Kai-shek, he was he was originally under Sun Yat-sen, and then after Sun Yat-sen died, he found that he could get support from America if he took a very hardline approach, which partially informed by his wife, Song Mei Ling. So he married into quite a wealthy family in Shanghai. What's really funny was the patriarch of that family, their father, named Charlie Sung, and this is something a lot of people don't know. He actually grew up in the United States in the 1800s. One of the ways this family actually made a lot of their money was in the 1800s, he was brought into a Southern Methodist church, and he was able to solicit donations and start a large print shop in Shanghai, printing Bibles. Charlie Sung and his descendants would use this kind of messaging to appeal to the people in the US. And through doing this, they were able to get a lot of donations, first from this large community who thought they were doing good. They were being told, oh, these donations are going to go to helping the Chinese who all want to become Christians. They all want to become American Christians. And if you look at the propaganda at that time, there was the Time in the Life magazines by Henry Luce. It's a really good place. You can see a lot of that stuff. And in America, the version they saw of China was just that they were basically becoming like Americans. So this positive sentiment aided Chiang Kai-shek in getting money from the United States to actually help fund himself. So remember, the Customs Service wasn't really giving Sun Yat-sen money, but through this annoying little loophole, Chiang Kai-shek was able to find money from another country entirely, the United States, and they would give him aid, and it would increase over time. By the end of the war, the end of World War II, it started prior, but it continued all the way through, and even till after. It amounted to $3.6 billion in dollars of that time. So it's a pretty staggering amount. His wife, Sung Mei-ling, if you guys have ever seen Zelensky going to Congress, which he does periodically.
The First Lady of America
Yes.
meets the First
Yes.
Lady of China. Madame Chiang Kai-shek's visit to the USA is a personal triumph. The first private citizen of any country to address the House of Representatives in Washington, Madame Chiang receives a tremendous ovation.
First of all, I want to assure you that the American people have every right to be proud of their fighting men in so many parts of the world. We in China, like you, want a better world, not for ourselves alone, but for all mankind, and we must have it. It now remains for you, the present representatives of the American people, to point the way to win the war, to help construct a world in which all peoples may henceforth live in harmony and peace.
There were several publications at this time as well. So along with getting this money from the US, which was increasingly going to Chiang Kai-shek, as he promised he would be able to unify China and turn it into an amazing partner for any American businessmen who wanted to partner with them. There was also a lot of intellectual conversation going on. So just as they funded Chiang Kai-shek himself, money from Americans was finding its way into a lot of publications, including publications which were being directed at China. So you see, as I mentioned, the peasants were suffering at this time. Just so it's not my hyperbole here, this is an example of that. So this is one of the kind of things that was being published in one of the student magazines. It's called the Chinese Students Monthly. This was 1921, right around this time that we've been looking at. Somebody's writing into it, and this is very much representative of the line of conversation that the young people in China were kind of starting to follow. So here the young people were saying, there's a heart-rending famine in northern China, and we need to figure out why that's going on. And then they go through and they actually list like the severity and the consistency of famines in China, and they are really trying to drive home the fact that this is an endemic problem. Now, 30 years later, 35 years later, when an event would occur in China, a series of natural disasters, the West would be told that that was by far the most devastating and most unexpected and most preventable disaster that China's ever had. People would be told that the Communist Party, which would come later, you could basically just say they're responsible for any deaths that could have occurred if there was any food shortage. But considering that, in the 1920s, right here, we have basically somebody writing a report saying that the famines don't really stop. But the solution that they have, the solution that they're trying to come up with, is they're saying we should have less people. We wouldn't have famines if we had less people. And they're pushing this belief pretty strongly. I believe there's somewhere in here where they're reporting that at this time there was like 32 million people being affected by famine. He's saying there's 639 cases of droughts in 18 provinces that this guy can find. And while I don't agree with his conclusion that the problem is the population, I think that is definitely the wrong way to go about solving something like that. And I think that's kind of like it's that type of Malthusian attitude, which basically implies that people can never figure out a solution. In here, he actually lists off how, as the population went up, their food production kind of stayed the same. So he concludes from seeing that, I think that's right here. He concludes from seeing that if the food production's not increasing at the same rate as the population, it must not be possible. But this completely obviously isn't considering the fact that if money isn't being invested back into people to make them more productive, if they're just so poor that they're basically just trying to farm to have something to eat and to pay burdensome taxes, you're not going to necessarily actually see the human creativity to figure out different ways to make more food coming through. Like, it takes some investment there, but when people have nothing, they don't tend to make these kind of investments. So he says here, he tried to see if there was any way that could possibly improve farming for the peasants, but he basically says that it doesn't really seem to be a factor. It doesn't really make a difference. And then he says, and the worst part is when there's a starvation in one province, if another province sends them food, that's not even good, because it could deflate their money, because they would be getting paid so much money for food, and especially if they have a good harvest, right? Then the money becomes worth less, and that's the problem. It's a very roundabout way of looking at things. The mindset, right, that's coming out in this periodical, which was intended to be read by any educated young Chinese people, And this mindset, you'll see again and again, and we'll get into that next week, where it comes from and what it led to and what it didn't lead to. You'll see that they're really trying to push the idea that financial capital is kind of what should be protected, right? Like they wouldn't want anyone with financial assets, money saved, right? They wouldn't want their money to lose value. But
Sorry, it's fixed. Somebody was on mute.
Okay. Yeah, so that's basically everything. If anyone has any questions, we can do that now. Matt, did you have any questions? You've kind of heard me talk about some of this before, so if there's something glaring I missed, I think you'd also know.
No, I think that sets the contextual stage really well, really well for the oncoming battle, and on multiple levels. So I guess, yeah, we have a little bit of time. So why don't we do this? If people have a question they'd like to throw at you, now is the time. Put your name in the queue box, or raise your little digital hand like we usually do, and raise a thought or a question that you'd like to share. I know Marty's bubbling with thoughts and ideas, as is always the case with creative personas. So Marty, do you want to start it off by sharing one of your observations, or Oh, Marty, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me now, Matt? I just unmuted.
Oh, sure, there you are. Okay.
Thanks, guys. Now, I just put my own specific thoughts for anyone who wants them in chat. There is an entirely additional, I'm not sure the enthusiasm for Sun Yat-sen. He obviously meant well, but for me, he's exactly parallel to Francisco Maduro in Mexico, almost simultaneously with him, following the collapse of Porfirio Diaz's monstrous tyranny in American-backed monstrous tyranny in 1911. Like Maduro, Sun Yat-sen was an innocent. He threw himself into the arms of the communists at different times, the Lenin communists in Moscow. He threw himself into the arms of Chiang Kai-shek, a very formidable figure who did know how to weld power, but in the most merciless way. Had we not had Mao, Chiang, surely on his record, even up to 1947, will go down as one of the greatest killers in modern history. The British Economist magazine, and this is after 65 years or more of the West revering Chiang Kai-shek, nevertheless reckons, and it's a conservative estimate, he killed about 10 million people. There's a wonderful memoir about the Chiang regime by this lady. She became a very great supporter of Mao, which discredited her in later years. But she wrote wonderful memoirs of horrific realities of life in China under Chiang in the 1930s and 1940s. She was the wife of a colonel, and a very influential colonel in the Chiang regime in Chongqing. And when the name comes to me, I'll put it in. If anybody, I think her name was Han something or other, if people would look her up. But she was... my apologies on that. But the thing is, Chiang is a very sinister figure. And the best scholarly introduction to him I know of and warmly recommend is in the first couple of hundred pages of David Bergamini's book, Japan's Imperial Conspiracy, which has a great deal on the strange, intimate relationship between Chiang and Hirohito and the imperialists in Japan in the 1920s and 1930s, which would disabuse anyone of higher opinions of either of them. Sun obviously was an idealist and meant well, but you know what they say about the road to hell, and he didn't have a clue how to bring it about. The communists, of course, are another story.
Yeah. So I've read a very good book or I think it's a very good book, at least in my opinion, on him too. I don't know if you're familiar with the author Sterling Seagrave. He wrote a book.
He's popular and reasonable, but does not go deep. I've just remembered the name of the lady I want to recommend to you. Wonderfully written memoir, a great indictment of Chiang, and Han Su-yin. She wrote a number of works, and she's an extraordinarily vivid memoirist. If you want to know what the texture, the feel of life, from the 30s.
Put a link, Marty, of her name in the chat box so people can look her up. But you're saying Lee Seagrave. Who is this?
Han Soo-yin.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. I'm finished. Go on, guys.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, yeah. So Sterling Seagrave, he wrote a book called The Song Dynasty. So, if anyone is familiar with Song Meiling, Song Qingling, Song Ailing, and their younger brother, they actually had two more even younger brothers, and the way they got all that money from the U.S., the fake corporations that they set up, the China Aid corporations, the way they were able to really play a lot of, including good-natured, well-meaning Americans, as well as Congress, a la kind of like a Zelensky style. That I got a lot of that written well in his book. Like Chiang Kai-shek, I definitely do not have any love for. He obviously he did have the people he had that you were talking about modeled after Mussolini were called I believe his blue shirts, pretty sure. There's the brown shirts and there's the blue shirts. One of them was what Mussolini had. Chiang basically took the other color, and he definitely looked up to that. But beyond that, his son was in a Nazi Panzer division. His son was in a Nazi Panzer division. But beyond that, the book even shows how Sung wasn't the real last name. That was created in the United States when a Coast Guard vessel wrote down Charlie's name as he said it, and he was saying his Chinese first name. It had two syllables, and they thought that the second syllable was the word son. So much about that family wasn't true, and I really enjoyed the way he kind of spelled it out. Chiang, his father was, whenever I was mentioning about the maritime customs, and I said there was the other agency, the salt agency, his father was involved in that salt agency. And in the paper we looked at, the British Roundtable Journal, I was so surprised when I saw this. They actually talk about him. He's mentioned briefly in here. When the British see the one thing that they liked about the Whampoa military cadets, I don't have all the answers, obviously, but the vibe I get was, for whatever reason, they were picking him out. They liked him at this time, but they went on to very much dislike him. And I think that might be later on when he started working more on the American side, because the British were, in a strong sense, competing with the Americans for influence in China. Even if it was just more like bankers competing, there was still a strong competition there. So it was in that long section where I skipped through, but it will be quick to find. Yep. This was before they even called him the anglicized name most people know him by. But basically, they did not like Sun Yat-sen. They did not like him one bit. But there was one person working under him that they actually liked, and it was Chiang Kai-shek, as they call him, Chiang Kai-shi. And the general in command of the Whampoa cadets, the method employed by the troops under his immediate direction when assaulting an enemy position is worth recording, where some scout units would run up, plant a flag, and then people behind the main body of Chiang Kai-shek's force would point guns at their backs with the threat of shooting them if they didn't progress to the flag. Once they got to the flag would be moved by a scout or someone sneaky, put forward. And again, if you don't make it to the flag, you get shot. So it's funny that they were quite happy about that plan, and they said they need to write it down. Maybe they wanted to use it later themselves. I'm not sure. So it's interesting how you see a lot of characters that we'll see later appearing there.
It seems like Kiev is learning from the Chiang Kai-shek military handbook, eh?
Yeah, well, whenever, and even now that we're kind of in this more casual section, I'll add that even whenever I was reading about that Shamin incident, I know, Matt, you know, I was telling you there was a section in there where they were almost gleefully recording the exact technique used by those protesters. And again, just the same way they were kind of promoting Chiang Kai-shek's way of thinking, they say, they describe it, and it's like a novelty to them at this time. Obviously now we would recognize groups of people marching through the US chanting slogans, like that's second nature, right? You wouldn't write home about that. But at this time in 1926, that was brand new. And they're commenting on it here. And they're saying, they're even talking about banners of all shapes and styles. The people would march 4x4, and they would repeat chants with rolling drums going, waving banners. But they even add here, what they yell is they're shouting like prearranged slogans, kind of like American college yells, which are taken up at repeated, frequent intervals. So you know how people will be like, when I say this, you say that. At that time, that wasn't something people even knew about. So they're saying, well, this is good, write this down. And I mean, whenever you look at like what happened in 1989, it's almost as though someone read this article and they're like, what can we use here but make it seem like it was organic like this one? It's so much parallels, and it's funny to see them first encountering some of these things.
What I was particularly impressed with your composition was especially the introduction of the Chinese Maritime Customs Service run by Britain. And I might have heard of it in passing, but I did not appreciate the power and necessity of this institution to fully dominate for a century or more the entire Chinese economy to the degree that it did. And even that you had high-level British officials referring to this as the model for the League of Nations, as you pointed out, is extremely insightful, really, really useful key.
And I think too, so the big question for me it left was towards the end, the directors, they transitioned and they were fine with an American being the director, but it was almost as though, from what I read, it was like they were kind of okay with that for some reason. And the question it left me was, I felt like it had served its purpose, right? But their new plan was to manage like this global exchange, right? They could just do it at the source, right? So with the IMF that got rolled in, with John Maynard Keynes enforcing the balance of payments, right? So that is the mechanism which keeps these countries poor to a large extent. Essentially, the quick rundown is like, say you grow coconuts, okay, you have oil under the ground, okay, Germany can sell you a oil refinery plant and a well. They can pre-assemble it, they can bring it, Germans will set it up. But guess what? Oh, you have to have a balance of payments, a 30-day balance of payments. Otherwise, John Maynard Keynes would say that that's just not okay. So don't worry, there's a solution for that. They're called credits, where basically you can have some time to pay it back. Well, no, they'll choose who they give those credits to. So there's this LaRouche Executive Intelligence Review article that I was showing Matt before, and they go right into it, saying how like there's a few countries where when they do give them longer term credits, people say, oh, it's a miracle growth. South Korea was an example. It was a miracle. They just gave them some longer term credits. And this is kind of a foreshadowing to the next presentation. But when you see China, after they opened trade with the US, what you see is them almost trying to drown them in credits. And it's quite interesting how that kind of plays out later down the line.
Yeah, it's a fun teaser for next week. That's good. That's good. So I'll give people one last chance. If they have a pressing question or a thought that they'd like to get off their chest, now's the time to do it. Otherwise, what we'll do is transition off into bedtime and then meet back. Well, Sunday we have a class on classical dance, actually by Nick Jones and his wife, Julia. But then we'll transition back to this part 2, introducing a new look at Mao, Chiang Kai-shek, that whole battle, and a lot more. So does anybody have a last question?
Yeah, if anyone, or is there anything that I didn't? Because the introduction part, which took up a lot of time, it's like I needed to kind of make sure that anyone listening wouldn't be like lost in understanding how they got to that point. But was there anything about the previous dynasties or anything that was maybe a bit unclear to anybody at any point? Matt, you got it all? Nothing was unclear to you?
Well, I think that there's a lot of questions, but at the same time, each one would just open up a whole Pandora's box of discussion. So let's do this. Let's meet back again next week, and I'm sure we'll be bubbling with thoughts and questions for you as you continue the story. So everyone, thank you for this Wednesday night, for sharing that with us, and thank you, Lee.
No problem.
Thank you, Lee.
Good night.
Bye now.